Let us look into the types of coordinated response. So we have voluntary and involuntary actions. So we are going to look at the differences between these two actions. As you can see here, this picture, if it is voluntary action, it is controlled by this part of the brain known as the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. As for involuntary action, it is controlled by the circled ones, the red ones, and that is the medulla oblongata. Okay, so we study on this table of comparison between these two actions. First, we look at the similarity that both of these actions involve stimulation, impulse involve neuron as well as effector organ. Okay, in terms of differences, voluntary actions are the ones that we are conscious of. That means we do it on our own will. But for involuntary action, it occurs automatically and we are not conscious of the actions happening. We are not aware of it. For voluntary action, it involves the somatic nervous systems. Okay, for involuntary action, it's the autonomous nervous systems. So by the terms here, auto. Okay, so for voluntary action, it is controlled by the cerebral cortex, but for involuntary action, it is controlled by the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus. So voluntary action involves the reaction of skeletal muscles because we are doing it out of our own will and we are conscious of the actions. But for involuntary actions, they involve the reaction of the smooth muscles, of the glands, and even the cardiac muscles. So these are examples of voluntary actions that involve the skeletal muscles. For example, when we walk, we talk, we brush our teeth, these are all actions that we are conscious of. For example, when we voluntarily raise our hands to answer questions, we do it on our own will. So voluntary actions involve skeletal muscles. They are controlled by the cerebral cortex. Since the information reaches the cerebral cortex, and that is our level of consciousness, our perception of surroundings can be produced. And therefore, we can make decision, we can plan for our response. Okay, we do it on our own will, we are conscious of it. So let's look at the information pathway in voluntary actions as demonstrated here in this picture, in this figure 12.10. Okay, so stimulus. First, we have the stimulus. That means the changes in the surrounding. That's going to result in the response. So stimulus occur when the teacher questions the pupils. So the pupils receptor receive the stimulus upon being questioned, and they are going to transmit the information in the form of nerve impulse to the cerebrum, and that is true. This type of neuron, remember, sensory neuron. So heading to the integration center, and that is the brain. So cerebrum is going to interpret the nerve impulse and it's going to send it to the relay neuron, and then after being interpreted, it's going to send it to the subsequent motor neuron. Remember the function of motor neuron, that it's going to carry these impulses that has been triggered after interpretation from the central nervous system, and that is the brain, to the effector. So in this case, the skeletal muscles that receives the information, and that the pupil will raise his hands to answer the questions. And thus we say that this is the response that is generated. This is the response that the pupil gives in response to the stimulus, which the teacher has just posed a questions to the students. Okay, involuntary, we have also these involuntary actions which involve the skeletal muscles, and we call it as the reflex response. This involves the three-neuron reflex arc. So several situations require immediate and also spontaneous action. Immediate and spontaneous action. Okay, so example, what are the conditions that requires this kind of action is that when you accidentally prick your finger on a sharp pin. So immediately you will move your finger without much thought. So this is an example of reflex action. So it is meant for protection from harm. So reflex action here is a fast response. Okay, it's a fast response to stimulus without being controlled by the brain. Without. Okay, so the nerve pathway involved in this reflex action is called the reflex arc. Reflex arc. Reflex action of moving the finger from the sharp pin involves three neurons and communication between the neurons in the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, and also the spinal cord. Okay, let's look into the figure. This is the reflex arc. The reflex arc. So there is this pin over here accidentally pricked on the finger. So sensory receptor is stimulated. When the finger is pricked by sharp pin, sensory receptor detects the stimulus and triggers a nerve impulse. So this nerve impulse is transmitted. So you get to see the transmission of the nerve impulse along the, what neuron is that? Sensory neuron, and heading to the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord in this case. So look at the arrow here. So this nerve impulse travels into the, remember this is the spinal nerves going in. This is the sensory neuron, okay, going into the dorsal root, into the spinal cord. That's the gray matter. A relay neuron is in between, intermediate between sensory neuron and also the motor neuron. Okay, going out through the ventral root and then to the effector. So in the spinal cord, the nerve impulse is transferred from the sensory neuron going through the synapse and then to the relay neuron, from the relay neuron to the motor neuron. So motor neuron eventually is going to transfer the nerve impulse from the spinal cord to the effector. So in this case, that's the muscle tissues that will immediately remove the finger quickly from the pin. So this is the reflex arc involving three neurons and a spinal cord. So what are the three neurons? They are the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and the motor neuron, involving as well the spinal cord. Okay, so what's the importance of this reflex action? Okay, it's real important because it is going to produce spontaneous responses without waiting for instructions from the brain. Okay, so it's only from the one that is involved, the central nervous system that is involved is the spinal cord. So additional time that is needed by the brain to analyze the information before triggering a response can lead to a serious injuries. So to say is like bypassing the brain. That means to the spinal cord itself is able to generate a proper response to tell the finger immediately to withdraw from the danger, and that is the pin, the sharp pin. So since reflex action involves the spinal cord, so the brain can focus on higher level thinking. Okay, so there is also this reflex arc which involves only two neurons. Okay, which uses this reflex, which uses the nerve pathway that involves two neurons. We call it as the two-neuron reflex arc. And what are the two neurons? They are the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Okay, are you familiar with this knee-jerk reflex? Have you done this before? Okay, you must sit on a chair with this the lower limbs in a relaxed condition, hanging, Okay, and then doctor is going to test the effectiveness, sometimes by just tapping on the knee using this rubber hammer. So there will be a jerk that will be produced upon being tested. So doctors sometimes test the effectiveness of uh, someone's nerve by this method. Okay, this is how it looks like. The reflex are in the knee jerk, which involve only the sensory neuron and motor neuron. Okay, take note that it is without the relay neuron. So first, the tendon, which is below the kneecap, is being knocked. Okay, so here, this is the tendon. The tendon is the structure that connects the muscles to the bone. So this tendon is being knocked. And what happened is the quadricep muscles is going to stretch, and then it's stimulating the stretched receptors to trigger nerve impulses. Okay, quadriceps muscle stretched stimulates the stretched receptors. So sensory neuron is going to transmit the nerve impulses straight away to the motor neuron, which is in the spinal cord. Okay, notice the arrow. Okay, this is the dorsal root and the ventral root. The spinal cord, this is gray matter and white matter outside. So next, what happens is this motor neuron is going to transmit impulses, which is from the spinal cord to the quadriceps muscles. You see the arrow to the quadriceps muscles. So this is these are the quadriceps muscles. And the response is that the quadriceps muscles is going to contract and causing the leg to jerk to the front. Contract, okay, causing the leg to jerk to the front. This muscles, quadriceps, contract. That means it goes like this, shortens, and therefore it's like jerking forward, like it's like a kicking forward. Okay, so that's how by tapping the tendon we can see the jerking of the leg forward. Okay, so reflex actions such as coughing. Okay, coughing is also examples of reflex action. So this action is able to protect the lungs from foreign particles from the external environment. Also the pupil reflex. Okay, anak mata kita berkelip-kelip. It's to protect the retina from being damaged. Okay, the pupil reflex.